text has always puzzled me because there's an essential question at the heart of this text. Why on earth did fishermen, lowly fishermen who depended upon every single catch, let go of their nets? Why did they leave their families? Why did they leave their livelihood to follow some random rabbi? Why would they do that? As I was preparing for today's sermon and as I was online, I engaged in a Facebook conversation. Some pastors got really clever this week with naming their sermon based on this text. We had hooking up with Jesus. It ain't right. On so many levels. Which is still better than hooking around with Jesus. Yeah. And then later on, like, a pastor friend of mine said, like, well, clearly those sermon titles were just clickbait. Which is just a really another bad pun about this peculiar story of these fishermen leaving everything behind to follow a random rabbi. Why did these fishermen leave their father, their families, their livelihood? When they were taxed sometimes up to like 90% of their wages, why would they leave everything behind to follow a random rabbi? Perhaps you're like me and you've seen some of the weird Jesus movies on TV or at the movie theater, and this story becomes even more peculiar because the Jesus that causes these people to leave everything behind kind of shows up a little stoned looking, like he's from California, and he's got on like a perfect pure white robe and like a American pageant kind of satchel. Like, well, again, why would they leave everything behind to follow him? Did they leave him because he had Fabio hair and the blue eyes? Because I know I would follow anyone with blue eyes.
Amen.
Or was it something else? Is there something much deeper going on in the story that we need to explore? Is there something much more rich that we need to uncover? I think so. To go back a couple thousand years, if we go back to the 1st century, we uncover all kinds of writings that the 1st century Jews were quite aware, because of oppression after oppression after oppression, that they were merely one generation away from having their story completely forgotten. So many civilizations and so many great cultures have been eliminated from history books because they failed to pass on the story one generation to the other. The great historian Josephus says this is why we value education so much. We have to instruct our boys and our girls to know Torah, to know story. There's another set of writings called the Talmud, and it has this great line. Under the age of 6, we do not receive a child as a pupil, but from 6 onwards, accept him and stuff him with Torah like an ox. If you don't pass on your story, you don't know who you are. And if you don't keep the story going, you might be eliminated. We have to keep telling the story. We have to educate the young children to know the story. So every child was brought up believing that there was nothing better in life than to study the story, than to know the story, and to pass on the story, to share the story of who we are. And so at the age of 6, kids would be invited into the local synagogue for something called Bet Sefer, which was the house of the book. And between ages 6 and 10, these kids would come in and they would memorize the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, memorized. And on the first day of this school, the rabbi or the teacher would slather their slates in honey. Honey being exotic. Honey being a sign of God's favor. Honey being pleasurable. And at the beginning of instruction, the rabbi would tell these 6-year-olds, now lick up the entire bit of honey, and may studying God's word always be this pleasurable, always be this exotic, always be this sweet. And then from ages 6 to 10, they would memorize Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you're thinking 6 and 10-year-olds can't possibly memorize all that, I so beg to differ. How many kids ages 6 to 10 have like every Disney song memorized? Or like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. What's another character? Daniel Tiger. Kids have Daniel Tiger songs memorized completely, and it tells them how to do everything from like go to the bathroom to being a good student. Kids can memorize. And these kids in particular memorized everything. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the best of those students were invited to go to another set of schooling. But most students were told to go home and learn their family trade, to ply your family trade, to be a fisherman, a carpenter, a farmer, a craft maker. But the best of that original school were invited to a second series of school, Bet Talmud, the House of Learning, and from ages 10 to 14, they would read and study and memorize the rest of what we might call the Old Testament. Memorized. All the prophets, all the Proverbs, all the Psalms, all the writings, memorized from ages 10 to 14. And they also learned how to dig deeper into the text. And that you dig deeper and you learn more about the text by constantly asking the text questions and allowing the text to actually ask you questions and to engage in this dynamic interplay of learning by asking essential questions. We began this sermon today by asking an essential question: why would fishermen leave everything to follow Jesus? And you learn more by asking such questions. So from 10 to 14, they learned this tradition of asking questions and memorizing the rest of what we might call the Old Testament. And at the age of 14, most of the kids were told to go home, to learn your family business, to ply your family trade, being a fisherman, a carpenter, a farmer, a craft maker. But the best of the best, the creme de la creme, were invited to go one step further. We're invited to maybe try to become a rabbi yourself. And the way in which you would do that is you would go out of your way to find a rabbi. And you would tell this rabbi, I want to follow you. I want to learn to do what it is that you do. And the rabbi would then engage in that sort of like deep level questioning. They would interview you. They would ask you all kinds of questions. And if you responded with questions, you were doing well. If you responded with really boring static statements, you were probably not doing so well. And so a rabbi would interview a student, and if the rabbi thought the student could do what the rabbi did, could understand the way this rabbi taught, then the student would be invited to become a disciple of this particular rabbi. It was the rabbi's way of saying, I believe you can handle my teaching. I believe you can do what it is that I do. I believe you can carry on my tradition. I believe you can carry my yoke. There was another rabbi that I'm particularly fond of, Jesus, who would later say, my yoke is easy. And so the best of the best and the best, the creme de la creme of the top, would be able to follow a particular rabbi, and they would try to learn everything they could about that rabbi. And there was this old midrash statement, there was this blessing that said, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. May you follow your teacher so closely and learn everything you can from that rabbi that you're like covered in their dust, so that you can learn everything that that rabbi has to teach you about the story and about how to live. The rabbi, when the rabbi would choose you, was saying, I believe in you. So we can imagine, on a particular sunny morning, there's some lowly fishermen who are taxed somewhere between 70 to 90% of everything that they make. Some lowly fishermen who had probably not made it out of the first years of schooling, who had been told, you aren't good enough. You aren't clever enough. Go learn your family trade. People who had been brought up believing that the best thing that they could possibly do in life was to study the scriptures, study the story, and then pass it along, but who had also been told, you're not good enough. Jesus comes onto the scene, a rabbi comes onto the scene and tells these people, come follow me. You may think you're not good enough, but I'm telling you, I believe you can do what I do. How easy is it now to imagine why they dropped their nets? Wait, this rabbi believes I can do what the rabbi does? This rabbi thinks I can participate in learning the story and then sharing the story. And then this rabbi actually goes one step further, because this rabbi references a really prominent passage in the prophet of Jeremiah. Jeremiah spoke and said that the world would be restored and reconciled and renewed by people who would be fishing for other people. Fishing for people. Wait. This rabbi not only believes that I can do what this rabbi does, this rabbi believes I can be the one that brings about, working with God, the restoration and renewal and reconciliation of all things. And so they dropped their nets and they left their families. And I imagine the sons of Zebedee had a little bit of a tear in their eye as they dropped their nets. And I believe that Zebedee looked at his sons with a smile and a tear in his eyes. And I think it was a beautiful, bittersweet goodbye. My children are good enough to follow a rabbi. My children have what it takes. Go. I imagine that Zebedee walked around for a few days in the villages with a bit of a swagger. I grew up as a pastor's kid. I grew up loving Jesus. I grew up believing in Jesus. I grew up learning about Jesus from the really highly sophisticated technological piece known as flannel board. I learned to love Jesus on flannel board, to believe in Jesus. And I had this passion at an early age to study these stories and to share with other people these stories. And somewhere along the line, like a lot of us, I experienced some hurt in the church. I experienced a sense of questioning. I gathered a sense of doubt, and I wondered if I had what it took. And I wondered if I believed enough in Jesus. And this haunted me for several years. But about 10 years ago, I began to learn something really, really important. I learned it through reading and studying works by Rob Bell. I learned it by going to a church just a couple miles that way. I learned it from preachers like Pastor Sue and preachers like Bishop Irwin. And from stories like this one. It isn't about, do I have enough belief and faith in Jesus? The deeper and more important question is this: Jesus has enough faith and belief in me.
Amen.
It's not about me believing in Jesus. Evidently, it's far more important that Jesus knows Jesus believes in all of us. I don't know what messages you've been brought up with. I don't know what messages you've soaked in from society. But Jesus is here today calling every single one of us. You have what it takes. You are called to be a minister. You are called to be a priest. You are called to be a child of God that passes on the unending love of God with everyone. You are called to work with God in the ongoing work of reconciling, restoring, and renewing all things. It isn't about whether you believe in Jesus. Jesus is telling all of us, Jesus believes in us, and Jesus wants you to believe in you. So may you, my brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ today, may you experience this installation service not about one particular pastor. May you experience this installation service as a reminder, Jesus believes in you. So you go out there and you turn the world, not upside down, turn the world right side up. And may you, as you study and as you learn, may it always taste sweet as honey. And may you always be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Amen.